By November 1944, the thousand-year Reich was collapsing. On every front, the once invincible German war machine was in full retreat. In the east, the Soviet juggernaut had chewed through Army Group Center, liberating Belarus and pushing into Poland and East Prussia. The Red Army was now poised on the very doorstep of the German heartland. In Italy, Allied forces were grinding their way up the peninsula, a relentless, bloody slog against determined German defenders. And in the west, the situation was even more dire. Following the successful Normandy landings, Allied armies had swept across France and Belgium with breathtaking speed. American and British forces now stood along Germany's western frontier, massing for the final push into the fatherland. The ring was closing. For the average German soldier, the war had become a desperate struggle for survival. The veterans who had stormed across Europe in the glory days of Blitzkrieg were mostly gone, replaced by hastily trained boys and old men das so-called Volksstern. Their equipment was often second-rate, and they were perpetually short of everything. But the most critical shortage, the one that crippled every aspect of the German military, was fuel. Allied bombing campaigns had systematically obliterated Germany's synthetic oil production facilities. Without gasoline, tanks couldn't move, planes couldn't fly, and supplies couldn't reach the front. The mighty panzer divisions, the spearhead of the German army, were often reduced to being towed into position by horses, becoming little more than static. The war of movement was over. Now, it was a war of attrition. Germany could not possibly win. Above the battlefields, the skies belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was a shadow of its former self. While German factories were still churning out impressive new aircraft, like the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, there was no fuel to fly them and no experienced pilots to man them. Allied air supremacy was absolute. Swarms of American P-51 Mustangs and British Spitfires roamed at will, strafing anything that moved on the ground. Day and night, fleets of bombers rained destruction upon German cities, factories, and railways, paralyzing the country's ability to wage war. For the German soldier on the ground, the constant drone of Allied aircraft was a terrifying reminder of their own helplessness. A sound signaled imminent death from above. Yet, amidst this landscape of total collapse, one man refused to see the writing on the wall. Deep in his gloomy East Prussian command post, the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler remained isolated from the grim reality, surrounded by a shrinking circle of sycophants. He dismissed the catastrophic reports from his generals as defeatism and cowardice. He would spend his days poring over maps, moving non-existent armies, and planning grand counteroffensives with divisions that existed only on paper. His health was failing, his hands trembled, and his mind was increasingly detached from the real world. But in this vortex of delusion, a final, monstrously ambitious plan began to take shape. Hitler was convinced that the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was a fragile, unnatural one. He believed that if he could inflict a single, stunning, and catastrophic defeat upon the Americans and the British, their will to fight would shatter. He imagined they would be forced to sue for a separate peace, allowing him to then turn his full attention to the East and crush the Soviets. It was a desperate gamble, a fantasy born of refusal to accept defeat. He needed a victory so dramatic, so unexpected, that it would change the entire political landscape of the war. He needed another blitzkrieg, one last lightning strike, to reverse the tide of destiny. And so, he focused his gaze on a familiar stretch of terrain. The rugged, forested hills of the Ardennes. It was the same area where his armies had achieved their most spectacular breakthrough against France in 1940. He believed that lightning could strike twice, by secretly amassing the last of Germany's armored reserves and striking through the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes. He could race to the port of Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies, and trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. This was the genesis of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein or Watch on the Rhine, was Hitler's personal creation. He overrode the cautious objections of his seasoned commanders, like Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Model. They argued the objective of Antwerp was far too ambitious given their limited resources. They proposed a smaller, more realistic operation aimed at merely disrupting the Allied advance. But Hitler would not be denied his grand vision. He demanded a full-scale offensive aimed at total victory in the West. He scraped together every last man, tank, and gallon of fuel. He assembled elite Waffen-SS divisions, the fanatical true believers, to lead the charge. The operation relied on a perfect storm of factors. It needed complete surprise, which meant maintaining absolute secrecy during the massive buildup. It needed poor weather to ground the all-powerful Allied air forces, giving the German panzers a fighting chance. And most importantly, it needed speed. The tanks had to break through and reach the Meuse River within days, before the Allies could react and bring their overwhelming superiority in numbers and materiel to bear. It was a plan that left no room for error. A roll of the dice with the very last chips the Third Reich possessed. To his generals, it was Medusa, suicidal fantasy. But to Hitler, it was the last, best hope for a dying Reich. To dream of victory. As the snows of winter began to fall in December 1944, the stage was set for one of the biggest and bloodiest battles on the Western Front. November 1944. The Western Front is a pressure cooker. Allied forces are pushing hard against Germany's borders, and the Third Reich is beginning to crumble. For many, the end of the war in Europe seems just around the corner. But in the secluded confines of the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler is about to gamble everything on one last monumental offensive. An operation so audacious, so utterly detached from reality, that it would go down in history as his final, desperate roll of the dice. This is the story of how the Battle of the Bulge was planned an operation born from delusion, against the better judgment of Germany's most experienced commanders. By late 1944, Hitler's view of the world had become dangerously distorted. He was increasingly isolated, relying on a small circle of sycophants and his own intuition. He looked at the American soldiers on the Western Front and saw not a determined, well-supplied army, but a mongrel society, a nation of immigrants who lacked the will to fight. He was convinced the American soldier was weak, inexperienced, and would break and run at the first sign of a powerful, concentrated German attack. In his mind, the alliance between the British and the Americans was fragile, a marriage of convenience that would shatter under pressure. He believed a sudden, shocking blow could not only halt the Allied advance, but also split their forces and their political will, forcing them to negotiate a separate peace. It was from this warped perspective that the plan Cody named Watch Tem Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was born. The concept was simple in its ambition and breathtaking in its arrogance. German panzer armies would smash through a weak, thinly defended section of the Allied line in the Ardennes forest, the very same place they had achieved a stunning breakthrough in 1940. They would then race across the Meuse River and drive northwest, all the way to the vital port of Antwerp. Capturing Antwerp would cut off the British and Canadian armies in the north from their American allies and, more importantly, from their main supply hub. Hitler envisioned trapping and annihilating nearly 24 Allied divisions, creating a disaster on the scale of Dunkirk. But in reverse, he believed this would force the Western Allies out of the war, allowing him to turn Germany's full might back against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. To his generals, this plan was not just ambitious, it was pure fantasy. The first to see the detailed plans were men who understood the grim realities of the war. Field Marshal Hedbone Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, was an old-school Prussian officer who was aghast at the proposal. He knew the state of the German army. His forces were depleted, exhausted, and desperately short on everything: fuel, ammunition, tanks, and trained soldiers. He called the plan a stroke of madness, arguing that simply reaching the Meuse River was a monumental task, let alone driving all the way to Antwerp. His concerns were echoed, and even amplified, by Field Marshal Walter Model, a tenacious and respected commander known for his defensive prowess. Model was a realist. He did the math. He calculated the fuel requirements, the ammunition consumption, the expected casualty rates. The numbers didn't just look bad, they looked impossible. He pointed out that the German Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self and could offer no meaningful protection from the overwhelming power of Allied air forces. Once the notoriously bad Ardennes weather cleared, German tank columns would be sitting ducks for Allied fighter bombers. Model argued that the terrain itself, the dense forests, narrow roads, and winding river valleys of the Ardennes was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare, guaranteed to create massive traffic jams and slow any advance to a crawl. Even General Elsenborn Ridge, the brilliant panzer commander, tasked with leading one of the main armored thrusts, was deeply skeptical. He was an expert in armored warfare, and he knew that speed was everything. The plan relied on capturing Allied fuel depots along the way. I hope he considered a self-deception. He warned that without captured fuel, the panzers would literally grind to a halt in the middle of Belgium, miles from their objective. He, along with Rundstedt and Model, proposed a much more limited, realistic alternative. They Kayets eat the small solution. Instead of a mad dash to Antwerp, they suggested a more modest attack aimed at encircling and destroying the American forces near Aachen. This would be a significant tactical victory, would disrupt Allied plans, and, most importantly, was actually achievable with the resources they had. But Hitler would have none of it. He summoned his generals to a series of tense, confrontational meetings. In these sessions, he was no longer a commander listening to advice. He was a demagogue, delivering a monologue. He would pace back and forth, launching into long, rambling speeches about the weakness of the enemy and the power of National Socialist will. He dismissed their concerns about fuel shortages, claiming the panzers would simply live off captured Allied supplies. He brushed aside warnings about Allied air power, insisting that a period of bad weather would give them the cover they needed. He saw their cautious, professional military assessments not as valuable input, but as defeatism and cowardice. He directly challenged his generals. When Motto presented his logistical calculations showing the plan was impossible, Hitler simply declared, "If you tell me it cannot be done, it still has to be done." His refusal to compromise was absolute. It was Antwerp or nothing. He believed that only a grand, dramatic victory could change the course of the war. The small solution, in his eyes, was pathetic. It wouldn't shock the Allies or split their alliance. It was a general's solution, a plan for a battle. Hitler was planning for history. The atmosphere was toxic. The generals felt trapped. They were sworn by a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler. An open defiance could mean disgrace, or worse. Rundstedt, old and weary, essentially washed his hands of the operation, delegating the details to others. Modoleva, the professional, did his best to plan for an operation he knew was doomed. He tried to build in contingencies, to give his troops the best possible chance, but he was working within a framework of pure delusion. Manteuffel prepared his men for a lightning strike, knowing that their tanks might run dry long before they reached their goal. So, by early December 1944, the die was cast. Despite the unanimous and logical objections of his most capable commanders, Hitler's fantasy was set to become a reality. An army was being secretly assembled, an army that lacked the fuel to reach its objective, the air cover to protect it, and the manpower to sustain a prolonged fight. It was being aimed at a section of the front line where American troops were resting, believing the Ardennes to be a quiet sector. Hitler's belief in his own genius, his contempt for his enemy, and his rejection of all logistical realities had set the stage for one of the biggest, bloodiest, and most desperate battles of the Second World War. The German soldiers gathering in the forests didn't know their objective was Antwerp, or that their leaders thought the plan was impossible. They only knew that the Führer had ordered one last great offensive, one final push for victory. And in the freezing cold of a Belgian winter, they were about to be thrown into the fire. December 1944. A hush has fallen over the Western Front. For the Allied soldiers dug in along the Siegfried Line, this quiet is a welcome, if uneasy, respite. They believe the German war machine is broken, sputtering its last fumes. They are dangerously wrong. Just across the border, hidden beneath the dense, snow-laden canopy of the Ardennes forest, a storm is gathering. This is Germany's last, desperate gamble. In the Eifel region, a vast and secret army is materializing as if from ghosts. An estimated 300,000 men, a force many Allied commanders thought impossible to assemble, are moving into position. These aren't just any soldiers. They're a mix of hardened veterans, survivors of the brutal Eastern Front, and fresh-faced teenage recruits, some as young as 6. For the veterans, There's a grim determination. They've seen the war turn against them, their homeland bowed to rubble. This offensive, codenamed Watched Ham Rain Watch on the Rhine, is their final chance to turn the tide. For the young boys, plucked from the Hitler youth, there's a mixture of fear and fervent indoctrination. They've been told they are the saviors of the Reich, that this is their moment of glory. The logistical scale of this buildup is staggering. Over 1,000 tanks and assault guns are being painstakingly maneuvered along narrow, icy forest tracks. The pride of the Panzerwaffe, the formidable king, tigers and panthers, are here. Their engines are muffled, their movements timed to the minute, executed almost exclusively under the cover of darkness. Every vehicle, every artillery piece, every supply crate is camouflaged with branches, white sheets, and anything that can blend into the winter landscape. The forest floor becomes a massive, concealed parking lot for Germany's armored might. Silence is the ultimate weapon. Soldiers are under strict orders. No fires are to be lit that could produce visible smoke. Idle chatter is forbidden. The clinking of equipment is minimized. The movement of entire divisions is a silent, creeping thing. German military police, the Feldgendarmerie, patrol the roads ruthlessly, enforcing the blackout and the strict radio silence. Any transmissions could be picked up by Allied intelligence, betraying the entire operation. The airwaves are dead quiet. It's an eerie, disciplined stillness, pregnant with the violence to come. Among the units gathering are the most feared of Hitler's forces. The Waffen-SS, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, and the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, are spearheading the attack. These are elite, fanatical formations, known for their battlefield prowess and their brutality. Their presence signifies the importance of this offensive. Hitler is not just throwing bodies at the problem, he is committing his Praetorian Guard. Their commanders, men like Septetrick, are old party loyalists, utterly devoted to the Führer's vision, no matter how detached from reality it may seem. Leading the charge is the enigmatic Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a seasoned but weary officer from the old Prussian school, and the more aggressive Field Marshal Walter Model, Hitler's firemen of the Eastern Front. They know the risks are astronomical. Their entire plan hinges on one critical, uncontrollable factor: the weather. Every single day, German commanders look to the skies, not for divine intervention, but for cloud cover. They are praying for fog, for low-hanging clouds, for snowstorms, anything to keep the Allied air forces grounded. They call it fouar, weather. They know that if the sky's clear, the Allied fighter bombers, the Jabos, will turn their armored columns into a shooting gallery, a massive, flaming graveyard. The supremacy of the Allied Air Force is the one thing that can, and likely will, doom their plan before it even truly begins. The morale of the average German soldier is a complex cocktail of hope and dread. They are better equipped than they have been in months, supplied with new winter uniforms and, for a brief moment, ample fuel and ammunition. Propaganda posters proclaim victory or Siberia. The message is clear. This is an all-or-nothing fight for survival. Many believe this offensive could force the Western Allies to the negotiating table, allowing Germany to focus all its strength against the advancing Red Army in the East. It's a slim hope, but it's a hope nonetheless. Yet, underneath it all, exhaustion runs deep. These men have been at war for 5 long years. They've seen friends die, cities crumble, and the world they knew disappear. They are tired, cold, and for all the bluster, they are scared. They know that beyond the trees lies the might of the Allied armies, a force that has pushed them all the way from the beaches of Normandy. In the days leading up to December 16th, the tension in the forest is almost a physical thing. Soldiers huddle in their foxholes, trying to stay warm, cleaning their rifles for the 10th time. They share stories of home, whisper about the coming attack, and try not to think about the odds. The Ardennes, which was a quiet, forgotten sector, has become the most dangerous place on Earth. The Allies see only a ghost front, a place for green troops to get experience and veterans to rest. They are blissfully unaware that they are sleeping on the edge of a volcano, that thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of thousands of desperate men are about to erupt from the trees in a final, furious, onslaught, the German war machine has gathered itself for one last, mighty punch. The world is about to be reminded, in the most brutal way possible, that the beast is not yet dead. The Battle of the Bulge is about to begin. Thank you for watching. December 16th, 1944. A biting cold settles over the Ardennes forests. The air is still, the snow-covered landscape deceptively peaceful. 4 months, this has been the Ghost Front, a quiet sector where green American troops, exhausted veterans, and thinly spread divisions catch their breath, believing the German army is on its last legs, broken and defeated. They are about to learn just how wrong they are. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the world explodes. Without warning, a deafening roar shatters the pre-dawn stillness. Over 2,000 German artillery pieces and rocket launchers unleash a biblical storm of fire and steel all along an 8-mile front. The ground shakes violently. Trees splinter into a million pieces. Shells scream down, turning serene forests into a hellscape of fire, smoke, and shrapnel. For the American soldiers huddled in their foxholes and makeshift shelters, it's pure chaos and disbelief. Many are literally blown out of their sleeping bags. The sheer scale of the bombardment is unlike anything they've ever experienced. Communication lines are instantly severed, radios go dead. Command posts are vaporized. Outposts that were manned just moments before simply ceased to exist. The sky is lit up by a terrifying, pulsating orange glow as the barrage continues. Relentless and methodical. Through the cacophony, a new sound emerges, the low, guttural rumble of engines. As the artillery barrage lifts like a curtain, the American defenders peer out into the surreal, flickering light. What they see is a nightmare. Ghostly figures clad in white winter camouflage are advancing through the snow, appearing as if from nowhere. These are the vanguard of Hitler's Volksgrenadier divisions. Behind them, the unmistakable silhouettes of panzer tanks, including the monstrous Tiger II, crunch through the frozen landscape. The American lines are incredibly thin. In many sectors, a few rifle companies are tasked with defending miles of terrain. These soldiers, many of whom have never seen combat, are now facing the full might of 3 German armies. They're isolated, outnumbered, and outgunned. The Germans are using searchlights bounced off the Lohaning clouds to create an eerie, artificial moonlight, further disorienting the defenders. It's a tactic they call spooky light, and it adds to the terrifying, spectral nature of the assault. In the northern shoulder of the attack, near a ridge known as Elsenborn, veteran American divisions like the 2nd and 99th Infantry are hit with overwhelming force. Small units fight heroically, holding out in isolated pockets of resistance, but they are systematically bypassed and surrounded. In the center, the main thrust of the 5th and 6th Panzer armies crashes against the U.S. 28th and 106th Infantry divisions. The 106th, nicknamed the Golden Lions, is a brand new division, its soldiers in Europe for less than 2 weeks, deployed in a dangerously exposed position called the Schnee Eifel. 2 of its regiments are quickly encircled, facing a catastrophe. The initial reports reaching higher command are fragmentary and confusing. Generals at headquarters, far from the front, dismiss them as a local counterattack, a spoiling action. The idea of a major German offensive is unthinkable. The Allied intelligence consensus was clear. Germany was finished, incapable of launching such a grand operation. The Germans are not just attacking, they are infiltrating. A special unit, Panzer Brigade 150, led by the notorious Waffen-SS Commando Otto Skorzeny, is operating behind American lines. His men, fluent in English and dressed in American uniforms, are driving captured American jeeps and tanks. Their mission is to sow chaos, to turn road signs, misdirect troops, and capture key bridges over the Meuse River. Every stranger is suddenly a potential enemy. The confusion escalates into full-blown paranoia. American sentries start demanding G-as-answered trivia about baseball or state capitals, anything to root out the German infiltrators. As the first day of the offensive unfolds, the news for the Germans is overwhelmingly positive. Their panzers are punching through the thin American defenses, advancing miles in just a few hours. The element of surprise was total, and the initial phase of the plan is working to perfection. Hundreds of miles away, in his Eagle's Nest command post, Adolf Hitler receives the incoming reports. A rare, manic smile spreads across his face. For the first time in a long time, A's Hubiland almost his generals, who had been skeptical, are now stunned by the initial success. Hitler sees this as a vindication of his strategic genius. He paces the room, animatedly explaining to his staff that this is the turning point. He believes his great gamble, this desperate roll of the dice, is paying off. The early breakthroughs reinforce his conviction that the American soldiers are soft, a mongrel society that will collapse under pressure. He is convinced that the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union is unnatural and fragile, and that this powerful blow will shatter it completely. In his mind, victory is not just possible, it is imminent. The Ardennes offensive, which he has codenamed Watch on the Rhine, is working. The storm he has unleashed is tearing a hole in the Allied front. But this is just the beginning. The shock and chaos of the initial assault would soon give way to a brutal and desperate struggle. The thin line of American soldiers, though battered and broken, did not shatter. In isolated towns like Vith and Bastogne, small groups of defenders would make a stand, defying the odds and buying precious time. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. It would become the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II, a crucible of ice and fire that would test the resolve of an entire generation. The initial German triumph was real, but the true fight was just getting started. December 16th, 1944. Before dawn, under the cloak of a bitter winter fog, the quiet forests of the Ardennes exploded. Over 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks surged forward, smashing into a thinly held American line. This was the start of Hitler's last great gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. The initial shock was overwhelming. The German 6th Panzer Army, the spearhead of the attack, aimed to slice through the American defenses and race to the Meuse River. Standing in their way were units like the Green, untested 99th Infantry Division. These GIs were spread dangerously thin, holding a line that should have been manned by a force 3 times their size. The Germans expected these inexperienced American troops to break and run. They threw everything they had at them. The ferocity of the artillery barrage was unlike anything the Americans had ever experienced. Shells rained down, turning the snow-covered ground into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel. Then came the infantry. Waves of elite German paratroopers and materializing from the mist, their gray uniforms a stark contrast against the white snow. The men of the 99th were outnumbered, outgunned, and in many places, completely surrounded. But they didn't break. They held. This crucial defensive stand became known as the Northern Shoulder. In key villages and along strategic ridges, American soldiers fought with a tenacity that defied all expectations. They understood a simple, brutal truth. If they gave way here, the road to the vital port of Antwerp would be wide open. This was more than just a battle. It was a desperate struggle to buy time. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Time for the Allied command to understand the sheer scale of the attack. And time for the famously bad Ardennes weather to clear, allowing Allied air power to join the fight. Take the heroic stand of the 99th Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, led by Lieutenant Lyle Bogue. A small group of only 18 men occupied a key ridgeline near the village of La. They were supposed to be an observation post, not a frontline fighting unit. But when a full battalion of German paratroopers, nearly 500 men advanced on their position, Bogue and his men opened fire. For an entire day, this tiny platoon held back the German advance. From their foxholes, they poured Accu-rifle and machine gun fire into the attacking waves. The Germans, convinced they were facing a much larger force, hesitated, regrouped, and attacked again and again, only to be thrown back each time. The platoon fought until their ammunition was almost gone and they were finally overrun. Their incredible delaying action held up the entire northern wing of the German attack for nearly 24 critical hours. This was not an isolated incident. All along the line, small, isolated groups of American soldiers fought with the same desperate courage. Platoons and companies, cut off from communication and supply, fought to the last man in the last round. Meanwhile, the veteran 2nd Infantry Division, which had been preparing to attack Germany, was rushed into the breach. They moved with incredible speed, force marching through the snow to reinforce the crumbling line. They slammed into the flank of the advancing German columns near a critical road junction called Elsenborn Ridge. The fighting here was savage and relentless. German panzers tried to smash their way through, but the American infantry, supported by well-placed artillery and anti-tank guns, refused to yield. The 2nd and 99th Divisions, fighting side by side, formed an unbreakable wall of steel and flesh. Elsenborn Ridge became the anchor of the entire northern front. No matter how hard the Germans pushed, they could not dislodge the defenders. This heroic stand channeled the German advance southward, disrupting their meticulous timetable and forcing them onto roads that were already becoming congested. While the American lines were bending under the immense pressure, they were not breaking, and as the Americans fought for every inch of ground, a critical problem began to emerge for the German attackers. Logistics. The entire German plan was built on speed and a captured supply dump. They needed to move fast, seize American fuel depots, and keep their tanks rolling. But the stubborn American resistance was causing massive traffic jams. The narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes became clogged with German tanks, assault guns, and supply trucks. The advance, which was supposed to be a lightning-fast blitzkrieg, began to slow to a crawl. For the panzer divisions, this was a disaster. Tanks are thirsty machines, and without fuel, they are nothing more than immobile steel coffins. Columns of elite SS panzers, the pride of the German army, began to grind to a halt, not because of American tanks, but because their fuel gauges read empty. German commanders grew increasingly frantic. They had gambled on capturing American fuel, but the GIS, even in retreat, were ordered to destroy their supply dumps. Giant plumes of black smoke rose into the winter sky as American engineers blew up millions of gallons of gasoline, denying it to the enemy. So, by December 18th, just 2 days into the offensive, a clear picture was emerging. On the ground, the battle was a chaotic series of desperate firefights. American soldiers, often isolated and outnumbered, were performing acts of incredible bravery, trading their lives for precious hours. Their sacrifice was stalling the German war machine. The German momentum, so terrifying on the first day, was already beginning to wane, strangled by its own logistical failures and the unyielding courage of the American soldier. The lines had bent, yes, but they had not broken. The crisis was far from over, but the first crucial battle, the battle for time, had been won by the defenders. The stage was set for one of the greatest and most brutal battles in American history. The clock was ticking. December 19th, 1944. The German juggernaut that had shattered the Allied lines in the Ardennes was now converging on a single, vital point. The town of Bastogne. This wasn't just another Belgian town. It was a strategic crossroads, a spider web of 7 major roads. Control Bastogne, and you control the movement of entire armies. For the Germans, it was the key to unlocking their path to the Meuse River and beyond. For the Allies, it was the linchpin that had to hold, no matter the cost. Into this crucible of fate marched the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They were veterans, hardened by the hedgerows of Normandy and the dikes of Holland, but nothing could have fully prepared them for this. They were a rapid reaction force, rushed to the front with little more than the weapons they could carry. They had no winter clothing, limited ammunition, and even less food. They were trucked in, a testament to the sheer desperation of the Allied command, and thrown into a fight for their lives. As they rolled into Bastogne, they weren't alone. They found a motley collection of troops, remnants of shattered armored and infantry divisions, combat engineers, artillerymen who had lost their guns, and medics working tirelessly. Together, this hodgepodge force, under the command of the 101st's acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had to do the impossible, form a defensive perimeter around a town that was, by all military logic, indefensible. The weather itself became an enemy, a bone-chilling cold, far colder than anything these soldiers had ever experienced, seeped into their very marrow. Thick soupy fog blanketed the landscape, reducing visibility to mere feet. It was a disorienting, isolating environment where the enemy could be anywhere. This fog, while a curse for the defenders on the ground, was a blessing in disguise. It grounded the Allied air forces, the mighty Jabos that had terrorized German columns, but it also grounded the German Luftwaffe, evening the odds in the skies above. The German ring tightened. Elite Panzer and Volksgrenadier divisions, flush with the arrogance of their initial success, slammed against the American perimeter from all sides. The fighting was brutal and intimate. It happened in snow-dusted forests, across frozen fields, and in the outlying villages surrounding Bastogne. American paratroopers and engineers dug Shalom foxholes in the frozen earth, fighting off tank assaults with bazookas and sticky bombs. Every house, every barn, every bend in the road became a miniature fortress, a point of desperate resistance. The sound of the battle became a constant, terrifying symphony. The whistle and crump of incoming artillery shells, the relentless chatter of machine guns, and the earth-shaking roar of tank engines. For the civilians of Bastogne, cowering in their cellars, it was a living nightmare. Their town had become a battlefield. Homes were reduced to rubble, and the streets were a landscape of destruction. They shared their meager food supplies with the American soldiers, their fate now inextricably linked with that of these foreign defenders. The medical aid stations were scenes of organized chaos and quiet heroism. Medics, working with dwindling supplies of plasma, bandages, and morphine, performed miracles under fire. The wounded poured in, suffering from shrapnel wounds, gunshot injuries, and the insidious effects of frostbite and trench foot. Every saved life was a victory against the overwhelming tide of death and suffering. By December 22nd, the situation was dire. Bastogne was completely surrounded. The defenders were low on ammunition, out of medical supplies, and surviving on scraps. The German command, confident that the trapped Americans were on the verge of collapse, decided to offer them a chance to surrender. 2 German officers, carrying a white flag, approached the American lines with a formal ultimatum. The message was delivered to General McClellan. It detailed the overwhelming German strength and the hopelessness of the American position, demanding an honorable surrender to prevent the total annihilation of the U.S. troops. McCulloch, upon reading the lengthy German demand, initially thought it was a joke. His staff officers debated the proper, formal response. What could they say? How could they articulate their defiance in the face of such impossible odds? McCulloch, a man of action rather than flowery words, cut through the discussion. He knew what his men were feeling. He knew their spirit. He scribbled a single word on a piece of paper, his official reply to the German ultimatum. That paper was handed back to the waiting German officers. When they asked for a verbal clarification, the American colonel delivering the message explained it simply. It means the same as, go to hell. The word, McCulloch had written, the word that would echo through history and become the defiant symbol of American resolve, was nuts. This single word electrified the besieged garrison. When the news spread through the foxholes, it was met with cheers. It was a gut punch to German arrogance and a massive boost to the morale of the freezing, starving defenders. It was a promise. We are the 101st Airborne. We are surrounded, we are outnumbered, and we will not break. The fight for Bastogne was far from over. In fact, its most brutal chapter was just about to begin. The siege would continue, the shelling would intensify, but the line would hold. All because one general, speaking for every single man on that perimeter, had the courage to give the perfect, concise, and utterly American reply. Just 3 days after launching their surprise attack, the Germans found themselves in a precarious position. By December 22, 1944, the blitzkrieg that was supposed to shatter the Allied lines was beginning to sputter and stall. The rapid advance, the lightning thrust that was meant to carry them to Antwerp, was hitting a wall. And that wall was made of American grit, blown-up bridges, and empty fuel tanks. Everywhere the Germans turned, they faced resistance. Small units of American soldiers, cut off and outnumbered, refused to surrender. They fought from foxholes, from ruined farmhouses, from the edge of dense forests. Every village, every crossroads, became a brutal, costly battle. These weren't grand, strategic maneuvers anymore. This was a desperate, grinding fight for every inch of ground. The GS, who the German High Command had dismissed as soft and inexperienced, were proving to be incredibly tenacious defenders. They were buying time with their lives, and that time was a resource the Germans simply couldn't afford to lose. A key factor crippling the German war machine was the very terrain they had chosen. The winding, narrow roads of the Ardennes were a logistical nightmare. They were perfect for ambushes. Endlessly blocked, American engineers became masters of destruction, blowing up crucial bridges over the Amblave and Somme rivers just moments before the German spearheads arrived. A panzer division without a bridge is just a collection of very heavy, very expensive paper. For every bridge that fell into the river, the German advance was delayed for hours, sometimes even days, as their own engineers struggled under fire to construct pontoons or find alternative crossings. And then there was the thirst. The German tanks, the mighty Panthers and Tigers, were incredibly thirsty for fuel. The entire plan hinged on capturing Allied fuel dumps, but the Americans, in their fighting retreat, made a point of destroying them. Every gallon of gasoline that went up in flames was another nail in the coffin of the German offensive. The columns of panzers, which had once seemed so unstoppable, started to lengthen and slow down. Tanks would run dry and simply be abandoned on the side of the road, their crews forced to join the infantry or wait for fuel that would likely never arrive. Nowhere was this crisis more apparent than with Kampfgruppe Piper, the elite SS Panzer group that formed the very tip of the German spear. Led by the infamous Joachim Piper, his force had pushed the deepest into American lines. But now, they were stranded. They had outrun their supply lines. Their path forward was blocked by demolished bridges, and their tanks were running on fumes. Piper's group was a powerful fist, but it was a fist at the end of an arm that had been severed from the body. Surrounded near the village of L'Église, they were a pocket of immense strength that was slowly starving to death, completely cut off, while the soldiers on the front lines were running out of fuel and ammunition. A different kind of breakdown was happening back at the German command headquarters. The initial euphoria of the offensive success was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a toxic atmosphere of blame and desperation. Generals who had been rivals for years were now openly pointing fingers at each other. Elsenborn Ridge, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, accused Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army of failing to make a decisive breakthrough. Dietrich, in turn, blamed the difficult terrain and the unexpectedly stiff American resistance. The carefully coordinated plan was unraveling into a series of disjointed, failing efforts. Overseeing this mess from his remote command post, the Wolf's Lair, was Adolf Hitler. His reaction to the news of the stalling offensive was not one of strategic recalculation, but of pure, unadulterated fury. He railed at his generals, accusing them of cowardice, incompetence, and even betrayal. He couldn't comprehend that his grand vision, his last great gamble, could be failing. He demanded impossible progress. He ordered attacks to be renewed with even greater ferocity. Ignoring the reports from the front that his prized panzer divisions were immobilized, his detachment from reality was becoming absolute, and his tirades only added to the chaos and paralysis gripping the German command structure. Caught in the middle were the staff officers, the men who had to translate Hitler's furious demands into actual military orders. They could see the writing on the wall. They looked at the maps. They read the supply reports. They knew the casualty figures. They understood that the operation was no longer just stalling. It was failing catastrophically. The window of opportunity, created by surprise and bad weather that grounded Allied air power, was closing fast. They knew that when the clouds broke and the American and British air forces returned to the sky, their exposed armored columns would be annihilated. There was a quiet desperation in the headquarters, a silent acknowledgement among the professional soldiers that the war was lost, and this offensive was just its bloody, final act. By Christmas Eve, December 24th, the situation for the Germans was dire. The advance had ground to a complete halt, miles short of its first major objective, the Meuse River. Piper's trapped battle group was forced to abandon their vehicles, including dozens of prized Tiger II tanks, and attempt to filter back to their own lines on foot. The Great Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had reached its high water mark. The tide was about to turn. The exhausted American defenders had held the line, and now, with reinforcements pouring in and the weather clearing, the Allies were preparing to strike back. The German dream of a swift victory had dissolved into a nightmare in the snow-covered forests of Belgium. What started as a bold German gamble had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The offensive was broken, not by one single decisive battle, but by 1,000 small acts of defiance, 1,000 logistical failures, and the unyielding pressure of an enemy that simply refused to break. The next phase of the Battle of the Bulge would be about the Allied counterattack and the slow, brutal process of pushing the German army back, once and for all. Thanks so much for watching. This part of the Battle of the Bulge really shows how bravery and logistics can stop even the most powerful attack in its tracks. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into military history. Let me know in the comments what you think was the single biggest factor in stalling the German advance. See you in the next one. For over a week, the Ardennes was a frozen hell, shrouded in a thick, suffocating fog. On T-ground, American soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fought desperately against the German onslaught. They prayed for a miracle, and on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1944, they got one. The skies cleared. It was as if the heavens themselves had decided to intervene. The impenetrable gray ceiling that had grounded Allied air power for so long simply vanished, replaced by a brilliant, crystalline blue. For the beleaguered G is shivering in their foxholes. It was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. The change was immediate and profound. A ripple of hope, then a wave of elation swept through the American lines. They weren't alone anymore. Help was coming from above, and come it did. The silence of the morning was shattered by a new sound, not the rumble of German tanks, but the roar of thousands of aircraft engines. The Jabos, as the Germans called them, the Allied fighter bombers, were back. Swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with bombs and rockets, descended like angry hornets. British Typhoons joined the fray, their cannons tearing into enemy armor. They were hunters, and the Ardennes was now their hunting ground. For the German panzer divisions that had roamed freely under the cover of the fog, the world turned upside down in an instant. The hunter became the hunted. One moment, a German column would be advancing confidently down a narrow road. The next, it was a scene of utter chaos and destruction. Thunderbolts would scream down from the sky, their 50-caliber machine guns strafing the length of a convoy. Trucks carrying vital fuel and ammunition erupted in fireballs. Soldiers scattered in panic, desperately seeking cover that didn't exist in the open fields. The roads became graveyards of twisted metal. A German officer later wrote about the sheer terror of it. He described how his men would dive into ditches at the mere sound of an approaching plane. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had relied on speed and surprise, was now pinned down by an enemy they couldn't fight back against. The sky, which had been their greatest ally, was now their deadliest foe. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical destruction. The feeling of invincibility was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread and helplessness. Nowhere was this change more dramatic than over the besieged town of Bastogne. The exhausted paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, completely surrounded and running low on everything, had held the line against impossible odds. Their Christmas miracle wasn't just clear skies. It was the drone of approaching C-7 transport planes. Hundreds of them filled the sky, a majestic and welcome sight. Then, like blossoms in the air, thousands of parachutes, red, blue, green, and yellow, drifted down. They carried everything the defenders desperately needed: ammunition, medical supplies, food, and batteries for their radios. As the crates landed safely within the American perimeter, cheers erupted from the foxholes. Men who hadn't eaten a hot meal in days wept with joy. The supply drop was more than just a delivery of material. It was a powerful message. It said, "We haven't forgotten you. Hold on. We are coming." The morale of the defenders soared. They knew now that they could, and would, hold Bastogne. The Allied air crews were relentless. They flew mission after mission, from dawn until dusk. Bomber groups targeted key bridges, railway junctions, and supply depots deep behind enemy lines, strangling the German war machine at its source. The logistical network that fed the panzer spearheads began to crumble. Fuel, the lifeblood of the blitzkrieg, dried up. Tanks ran out of gas and were abandoned by their crews, becoming nothing more than static steel coffins waiting to be picked off by fighter bombers or advancing American infantry. The German High Command's ambitious gamble depended entirely on a swift victory before the weather turned. They had lost that gamble. The clear skies of Christmas revealed the fatal flaw in their plan. They had thrown everything they had into one final, desperate offensive, and now, exposed under the open sky, their army was being systematically dismantled from the air. For the American soldiers on the ground, the change was electrifying. They could now advance with newfound confidence, knowing the sky was filled with friends. An artillery spotter plane, a little Piper Cub, could now circle lazily overhead, calling in devastatingly accurate artillery strikes on any German position it saw. Infantrymen watched with satisfaction as P-47 SA dive-bombed enemy strong points that had been holding up their advance for days. The partnership between ground and air forces was seamless and deadly. The balance of power in the Ardennes had shifted, decisively and irreversibly. The desperate defense was turning into a confident counterattack. The initiative was back in Allied hands. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the siege of Bastogne was broken. Lead elements of General Patton, his Third Army, punched through the German lines and linked up with the 101st Airborne. The relief was not just tactical, it was symbolic. It marked the beginning of the end for the German offensive. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on for another month, with much brutal fighting still to come. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The crisis had passed. The turning point had been those few critical days, starting on Christmas Eve, when the clouds parted. It was a stark reminder of the awesome power of air supremacy in modern warfare. The German Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great throw of the dice, was ultimately broken not just by the courage of the soldiers in the snow-covered forests, but by the pilots who ruled the clear, cold winter skies above them. The skies had cleared, the Allies had struck back, and the path to victory was once again visible. December 1944. The Ardennes forests is a frozen hell. American forces are reeling from Hitler's last-ditch offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. In the heart of this chaos, one Belgian town, Bastogne, becomes the linchpin of the entire Allied line. Surrounded and besieged, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne are holding on by a thread, famously telling the Germans nuts when asked to surrender. Their survival, and perhaps the outcome of the war in Europe, hinges on a single question. Can anyone break through to save them? Just days before, General Georges Patton Jr. and his Third Army were more than 100 miles to the south, driving eastward into Germany's Saar region. Their mission was clear. Their momentum was strong. But as reports of the German onslaught in the Ardennes flooded Allied command, Patton saw something no one else did. Not just a crisis, but an opportunity. An opportunity for a counterstroke so audacious it bordered on madness. On December 19th, at a tense high command meeting in Verdun, General Eisenhower laid out the grim situation. He asked his generals how long it would take to shift their forces to counter the German thrust. Most suggested a week, maybe more. Then it was Patton's turn. He calmly announced he could have 3 divisions attacking north towards Bastogne in just 48 hours. The room was stunned. How was this possible? What they didn't know was that Patton, ever the aggressive strategist, had already anticipated this. His staff was already working on 3 separate contingency plans for a northward turn. He wasn't just reacting. He was a step ahead. The order was given. "This is it," Patton told his staff. "The whole damn war may depend on this." What followed was one of the most incredible logistical feats in military history. The Third Army, an enormous force of over 250,000 soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces, had to perform a 90-degree pivot in the dead of winter. Imagine turning an entire city on its side in 2 days. Trucks, tanks, and half-tracks that had been rolling east were now screeching to a halt, turning and thundering north. Military police worked around the clock, standing at frozen crossroads, waving columns through in a non-stop river of steel. The Red Ball Express, the famed Allied supply convoy system, was redirected, its drivers pushing themselves and their vehicles to the limit to get fuel ammunition, and food to the front lines of this new, unplanned battle. The roads were a nightmare of ice and snow. Vehicles skidded and crashed. Engines froze. Soldiers, already weary from months of fighting, were now battling the elements as much as the enemy. They slept in their trucks, ate cold rations, and endured sub-zero temperatures, all driven by the urgency of the mission. Patton was everywhere, a whirlwind of energy, flying in his small spotter plane, driving his jeep to the front, cajoling, encouraging, and sometimes cursing his men forward. He knew that speed was everything. Every hour lost meant more pressure on the defenders of Bastogne. By December 22nd, the first elements of Patton's Third Army were ready. The 4th Armored Division, one of his spearhead units, was poised to attack. Their objective was simple: punch a hole through the German lines and create a corridor to The fighting was brutal. The Germans, desperate to keep the Bastogne pocket sealed, threw everything they had at Patton's columns. They fought from concealed positions in the thick, snow-covered forests and fortified villages that dotted the landscape. Every town became a miniature fortress, every hill a deadly obstacle. The advance was measured in yards, paid for in blood and steel. The tankers of the 4th Armored fought relentlessly, their Sherman tanks dueling with German panzers and anti-tank guns in the swirling snow. Finally, on the day after Christmas, December 26th, a breakthrough. A small task force from the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams S., the man the M1 Abrams tank is named after, made a daring final push. After hours of intense combat, they smashed through the last German defenses and rolled into the American lines around Bastogne. The siege was broken. The first tank to make contact, named Cobra King, carried a message of sheer relief. Supplies and reinforcements began to pour in, and the wounded could finally be evacuated. The exhausted but defiant paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had held the line, and Patton's gambit had paid off. Meanwhile, back in his Eagle's Nest headquarters, the news reached Adolf Hitler. He was incandescent with fury. His grand plan, the offensive that was meant to split the Allies and force a negotiated peace, was unraveling. But Hitler could not accept that his strategy was flawed. Instead, he raged at his generals, accusing them of incompetence, cowardice, and even treason. He screamed that they had failed to follow his orders, that they had squandered the opportunity he had given them. He couldn't see that the plan was doomed from the start, a fantasy built on overstretched supply lines and underestimated Allied resolve. The failure to take Bastogne was a critical blow, and Patton's lightning-fast relief effort was the hammer that shattered Hitler's Ardennes dream. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on for another month, but the turning point had been reached. Patton's 90-degree turn, an act of sheer will and logistical genius, had not only saved Bastogne, but it also sealed the fate of the Third Reich. It was a masterstroke of generalship that would be studied for generations, a testament to what can be achieved when bold leadership meets unwavering determination. December 28, 1944. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, was collapsing. The panzers that had once shocked the world were now bogged down, not just by American resistance, but by mud, snow, and a critical lack of fuel. While German soldiers were freezing to death in the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, their supreme commander was descending into a maelstrom of fury and denial, deep within the concrete confines of his Eagle's Nest command post. The atmosphere in the briefing room was thick with fear. Maps were spread across a heavy oak table, but the lines drawn on them no longer reflected reality. They represented phantom armies, divisions that existed only on paper. Their fighting strength bled away in the frozen woods. Hitler, his face pale and his left hand trembling uncontrollably, stared at the maps, but he didn't see the truth. He saw betrayal. He began to speak, his voice low and menacing. He accused his generals of cowardice, of incompetence, of a fundamental lack of National Socialist will. The offensive wasn't failing because of Allied air power or the heroic defense of Bastogne. It was failing because his commanders had lost their nerve. The room was silent, save for the tremor in Hitler's voice, which was steadily rising in pitch and volume. Then, the explosion. His fist slammed down on the table, rattling the map pins. He started screaming, spittle flying from his lips. He railed against the general staff, The old Prussian aristocracy he had always despised, accusing them of actively sabotaging his grand vision. He shrieked that they were traitors, that they had always been waiting for him to fail. Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl, his closest military yes-men, stood rigidly, their faces impassive masks, accustomed to these volcanic eruptions of rage. They knew better than to interrupt. Any attempt to inject reality into the situation would only redirect the Führer's wrath onto them. He paced the room like a caged animal, his gait a shuffling, stooped caricature of the man who had once mesmerized millions. He threatened courts-martialized. He declared that if the generals couldn't find the will to win, he would find men who could. He spoke of replacing experienced commanders with young, fanatical SS officers, men whose loyalty was beyond question, even if their tactical knowledge was non-existent. To Hitler, belief was more powerful than bullets. Faith could move mountains, and it could certainly move tanks that had no gasoline. His tirades would often veer into the bizarre. He would blame the weather, calling it He accused the German people themselves of becoming weak, of failing to live up to the heroic destiny he had laid out for them. If Germany was to be destroyed, he ranted, then the German people deserved their fate. They had proven themselves unworthy of his genius. It was a terrifying glimpse into his mindset, a nihilistic disregard for the very nation he claimed to champion. If he was going down, he would pull the entire world down with him. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the men of the 5th and 6th Panzer armies were living the grim reality of Hitler's fantasy. They were boys of 17 and veterans of the Eastern Front, all ground down to the same level of exhaustion and despair. They huddled in frozen foxholes, their thin greatcoats offering little protection against the biting wind. Frostbite was as great an enemy as the Americans. Rations were gone. They ate melted snow and, if they were lucky, a few boiled potatoes scavenged from a ruined farmhouse. A young Panzer Grenadier, perhaps only 18 years old, scribbled a final letter home by the light of a flickering candle stub. He didn't write of glory or the fatherland. He wrote of the cold, the unending, bone-deep cold. He wrote of his friend who had fallen not to a bullet, but had simply frozen to death in his sleep. He wrote of the constant shelling, the terrifying American fighter bombers they called Jabos, that appeared from the gray skies to hunt them like animals. He knew the offensive was over. Every soldier knew. The chatter on the radio was desperate, the orders from headquarters increasingly frantic and disconnected from their plight. Officers, who just weeks before had spoken of reaching the Meuse River and splitting the Allied armies, now focused only on survival. How could they extract their men? How could they save the handful of remaining tanks and assault guns? They received insane orders from Hitler's bunker. Hold at all costs, attack without delay. They were ordered to perform miracles with starving men and empty fuel tanks. Some commanders quietly ignored the directives, trying to pull their units back in some semblance of order. Others, fearing the wrath of the Führer, sent their men on suicidal attacks against impossible odds. Back in the eagle's nest, the rage subsided, replaced by an eerie, delusional calm. Hitler would sit for hours, staring into the fireplace, attended by his physician, Dr. Morau, who kept him functioning with a cocktail of drugs. He would talk to his secretaries and aides, not of the failing battle, but of the past. He'd reminisce about his early days in the Nazi Party, of the street brawls, and the political victories. He would speak of the future, of the superweapons that would soon turn the tide, of wonder rockets and jet fighters that would sweep the Allied bombers from the skies. He lived in a bubble of his own creation, a world where will was reality and failure was impossible. On December 30th, the news was unequivocally grim. American forces had not only held Bastogne but were now counterattacking, slicing into the flanks of the German Bulge. The dream of reaching Antwerp was a distant, laughable memory. Yet, in the briefing that day, Hitler was focused on a new plan. A new offensive, Operation Nordwind, a smaller-scale attack in the Alsace region to the south. His generals were again. They didn't have the resources to sustain the fight in the Ardennes, let alone open another front. They tried to reason with him. They showed him the casualty figures, the fuel reports, the intelligence on growing Allied strength. It was useless. Hitler waved their concerns away with a flick of his trembling hand. He saw their caution not as professional military advice, but as more evidence of their weakness, their defeatism. He accused them of wanting to surrender. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. The decision was made. Nor wind would proceed. More divisions would be stripped from other fronts, further weakening Germany's overall position, all to feed the Führer's desperate need for a victory. Any victory. As the meeting concluded, the generals filed out, their faces grim. They were trapped, forced to carry out the orders of a man who was no longer connected to the world, a man leading them all into the abyss. The chasm between the wolf's lair and the front lines had never been wider. In one, a madman raged against reality, surrounded by sycophants and fueled by drugs. In the other, his soldiers, the supposed beneficiaries of his genius, died cold and alone in a forest. Their last thoughts, not of their Führer, but of a warm bed, a hot meal, and a home they would never see again. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a military defeat. It was the ultimate, tragic expression of a regime built on a foundation of lies, a foundation that was now crumbling under the weight of its own madness. As the new year of 1945 dawned, the great German gamble in the Ardennes was entering its final, desperate act. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allied armies had shattered against the iron will of defenders at Bastogne, Vith, and Elsenborn Ridge. Now, the tide was turning. The Bulge, that massive salient punched into the Allied lines, was about to be squeezed from both sides in a pincer movement of overwhelming force. From the north, Field Marshal Montgomery's British and American forces began a methodical, grinding advance. The U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, pushed relentlessly southward. The weather, which had so favored the initial German attack, was beginning to clear. The dreaded Allied air power, the Jabos, or fighter bombers, returned to the skies. For the German columns now trying to withdraw, the open roads of the Ardennes became a death trap. P-47, Thunderbolts, and Typhoons swooped down, their cannons and rockets tearing apart tanks, trucks, and any soldier caught in the open. Simultaneously, from the south, General Patton's Third Army, having already performed the incredible feat of relieving Bastogne, pivoted and drove north with characteristic ferocity. The fighting was brutal, fought in the depths of a bitter European winter. Snow-covered forests and frozen hillsides became scenes of intense, close-quarters combat. The American GIs, many of them replacements thrown into the fray, fought with a tenacity born of survival. They faced determined, often fanatical, German resistance. SS Panzer units and Volksgrenadier divisions, though depleted, fought for every village, every crossroads. The German retreat was anything but orderly. It was a chaotic scramble to escape the closing jaws of the Allied pincer. The roads were clogged with a tangled mess of abandoned equipment. King Tiger tanks, the most feared armored vehicles of the war, were left stranded, not by enemy fire, but simply because they ran out of fuel. The logistical nightmare that had plagued the German offensive from the start now became its undoing. There was no fuel, no ammunition, and no hope of reinforcement. The once proud panzer divisions were reduced to hollow shells. The veteran soldiers, the experienced NCOs and officers who had formed the backbone of the Wehrmacht, were gone. They lay in the frozen Ardennes mud, casualties of a plan that was bold but fundamentally flawed. These were men who could not be replaced. The industrial might of Germany was already crumbling under the Allied strategic bombing campaign, and the training grounds were empty. The last of Germany's strategic reserve, both in men and machines, had been squandered in the snow. Units that had entered the Ardennes with over 100 tanks were lucky to escape with a dozen. The 5th and 6th Panzer armies, the tip of Hitler's spear, were effectively annihilated as cohesive fighting forces. As they limped back towards the German border, they left behind a trail of destruction, a testament to the scale of their defeat. The roads were littered with the blackened husks of Panther tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. The Bulge was shrinking, and with it, any remaining hope for a German victory in the West. The human cost was immense on both sides, but for the Germans, the losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. They had thrown everything they had into this one final offensive. Tanks, guns, and most importantly, their last reserves of trained, motivated soldiers. were all consumed in the Ardennes fire. The gamble had failed, and the price was total exhaustion. The path to the Rhine, and to the heart of Germany itself, was now open. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a defeat. It was the death knell of the German army in the west. The end was now in sight. The gamble had failed. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate throw of the dice, had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. By January 9th, 1945, the once feared German panzers were in full retreat, a shadow of the force that had punched through the American lines just weeks before. The bulge in the Allied front, which had given the battle its name, was being systematically squeezed out of existence. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the dream of turning the tide was over. Now, only survival remained. The cost of this failure was staggering. The Germans had thrown nearly 500,000 men into the Ardennes, along with their best remaining tanks and aircraft. They lost over 100,000 of those soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The material losses were even more catastrophic. Nearly 600 tanks and assault guns, machines that were now utterly irreplaceable, lay wrecked in the snow-covered forests and frozen fields. The Luftwaffe, in its last major aerial operation of the war, had lost hundreds of planes and, more importantly, hundreds of experienced pilots it simply could not replace. Germany's strategic reserve, the very force meant to defend the Reich itself, had been shattered, while the Western Allies regrouped, battered but ultimately victorious. A storm of biblical proportions was gathering in the east. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet Union unleashed the Vith offensive. It was an operation of almost unimaginable scale. Nearly 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed into the depleted German lines in Poland. The German Army Group A, stripped of its panzer divisions to fuel the Ardennes adventure, simply evaporated under the onslaught. The Soviet advance was terrifyingly swift. In a matter of days, they had broken through and were pouring into the heartland of Germany. Cities that had not seen a foreign soldier in over a century were now in the direct path of the Red Army. Warsaw, a city of ghosts after its brutal suppression, was liberated. The Soviet tide washed over historic German lands like Silesia and East Prussia, unleashing a wave of panic. Millions of German civilians, terrified by years of their own government's propaganda about the subhuman nature of the Soviets, fled westward in a desperate exodus. Trudging through the brutal winter snows, the Eastern Front had not just bent, it had shattered completely. Back in the West, the Allied commanders, Eisenhower, Bradley, and Montgomery, could now plan their final moves with a grim certainty. The German army facing them was a hollowed-out shell. The destruction of the panzer divisions in the Ardennes meant there was no significant mobile reserve left to counter a major Allied push. The road to the Rhine, Germany's last great natural barrier in the West, was open. The logistical machine of the Allies, which had been strained to the breaking point in December, was now humming back to life, pouring endless streams of men, fuel, and ammunition to the front. The question was no longer if the Allies would cross the Rhine, but when and where. And where was the architect of this catastrophe? Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler had retreated into the subterranean world of the physical world above, with its collapsing fronts and fleeing populations, seemed to exist in a different reality. Down in the stale, recycled air of the concrete tomb, Hitler's world had shrunk to the maps spread out on his table. But even the maps told a story he refused to believe. Surrounded by a dwindling circle of loyal sycophants, he raged against the perceived failures of his generals. He accused them of cowardice, of treason, of incompetence. He could not, or would not, accept that his own grand strategy, the Ardennes offensive, was the very thing that had sealed Germany's fate. In his mind, the offensive had been a stroke of genius, betrayed by commanders who lacked his revolutionary fervor and will to win. He would move pins on the map, representing armies that no longer existed as effective fighting forces. He would issue orders for counterattacks to be carried out by divisions that were down to a few hundred exhausted men with no fuel or ammunition. His physical and mental deterioration accelerated. His hands trembled. His stoop became more pronounced, and his rages became more frequent and disconnected from reality. He spoke of wonder weapons that would miraculously save the Reich, of political divisions that would split the Allied coalition, of a final, glorious battle for Berlin. He was a man living entirely within a fantasy of his own creation, while the real world was closing in to destroy him and the nation he had led to ruin. The news from the Vistula of the Red Army advancing 50, 60, 70 miles a day was dismissed as exaggeration or temporary setbacks. The generals who brought him these truths were berated and fired. The period from January 9th to the 25th marks the true point of no return. It was the moment the illusion died for all but the most fanatical. The Battle of the Bulge had not been a daring gamble that almost succeeded. It was a suicidal act of strategic bankruptcy. It had bled the Wehrmacht of its last reserves of armor, fuel, and trained men, leaving both the eastern and western fronts fatally exposed. As the Western Allies prepared to strike at the heart of Germany across the Rhine, the Red Army was already at the gates of the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. The pincer was closing. There would be no miracle weapons, no political salvation. The final, agonizing death throes of the Third Reich were about to begin, and the road to unconditional surrender was now clear. The historical truth is undeniable. The failure in the Ardennes did not just hasten the end of the war. It ensured that the end would be one of total, unconditional, and catastrophic defeat for Nazi Germany. The doom of the Third Reich was sealed, not in the rubble of Berlin, but in the snowy forests of the Ardennes. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter of history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments of the Second World War. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. We'll see you in the next one.